3, 2, 1. We are live now.
Warm welcome to this unique session organized by Pediatric Orthopedic Society of India. I am Dr. Dhiren Ganjwala, the president of the society, and along with my executive council member, Dr. Manoj Padman, we welcome you to this webinar. The topic of this webinar is very different, and it's not related to pediatric orthopedic or even orthopedics. The topic is life lessons from legends. You must be thinking, why did we organize such session? Let me give you a few background about this session. Few days back, one of my colleagues, who is a gastrosurgeon, Dr. Sanjay Haribhakti, published a book about his big 5 lessons of his life. To unveil the book, he invited 5 eminent gastrosurgeons of India to speak about their life lessons. And I listened to these experts and I thought, if gastrosurgeons can do it, why not we as an orthopedic surgeon can do it and help our younger generation of orthopedic surgeon. So then we started looking around for an expert who is good at research, who is good at academics, who has a good clinical experience and practice, and in addition, who can contemplate, who can reflect and think which strategy worked and which did not work. We thought of few people, but only few experts met all the criteria. And Professor Stuart Weinstein is one of them who met all the criteria. And that's why we invited him. And we are very happy that he accepted our invitation and he agreed to share his experience. I'm sure this session will help all of us to modify the perspective of our life so that ultimately we become more successful and happy in the life. Before I invite Professor Weinstein, I would like to request Dr. Manoj Padman to share few things about Professor Weinstein. So that will give us an idea that how busy, how successful, and how strong academician he is. Over to you, Manoj. Thank you.
Thanks, Dhiren, and warm welcome to Professor Weinstein. Professor Weinstein doesn't need any introduction to any student of orthopedics, and certainly not to any pediatric orthopedic surgeon, whether he's a student training or a trainee or a practicing surgeon. Nevertheless, it's my duty to kind of give a brief overview of his life work, to put it in simple terms. He is the Ignacio Ponseti Chair and Professor of Orthopedic Surgery and Professor of Orthopedics at the University of Iowa. He, having qualified from, acquired his medical degree from the same university in 1972, he joined there as a faculty in 76 and has been there since then. The list of his publications, research work, and contributions to orthopedics and the awards are far too innumerable to list out. Notably, he's edited 5 textbooks, some of which are quite familiar to us: Level and Winter's textbook of pediatric orthopedics, Turek's textbook of orthopedics. He's received numerous awards for his research, specifically to highlight on scoliosis and spinal deformity, and relevant to pediatric orthopedics, the natural history of various pediatric orthopedic musculoskeletal problems. In 2010, he was conferred the Lifetime Achievement Award by POSNA. Amongst the various positions that he's held, he's been the past president of American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, the American Orthopedic Association, POSNA, and the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the JBJS. Welcome, Professor Weinstein. We look forward to hearing your wonderful talk.
Well, thank you so much for having me this evening, and hopefully the comments I share with you today will be of some help to you in your life. And so this is entitled Life Lessons, and I've given 6 guideposts for life. And whoops, sorry. I have no industry conflicts. I have a grant from OREF, but no industry conflicts. So we all practice in different healthcare systems. you may or may not be familiar with the American healthcare system, but you're very intimately familiar with yours. So please keep in mind as I make some of the comments today, you have to view them in the context of your own healthcare system and, how you actually have to practice. Now, if there's any young trainees on board today, you work in an ideal medical center, you're looking forward to your practice. Everything is just wonderful where you are, and you're looking forward to your life, as we say in America, in Pleasantville, someplace where the sun is always shining, there are no problems, and life is wonderful. But there are always obstacles in the road of life and challenges that you're going to have in your professional life. And each of you in your professional careers sets a goal. This happens to be me climbing a mountain. I like to climb mountains, and you want to get to the top or reach your goals. And what I hope to give you today is what I would consider some guideposts for life, things that you should think about as a orthopedic surgeon and a professional going forward. And the first guidepost is that as a physician, you have to maintain public trust. The public has to know that they can trust you. You are in a noble profession. These are Time magazine covers of Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine, Michael DeBakey, a pioneering heart surgeon, Albert Schweitzer, a noted third world provider of care to those underprivileged. You have a great deal of respect from your patients and from the nation. You have a contract with society as a physician, which is based on professionalism, and you have to be able to maintain public trust if we as a profession are going to survive. And public trust is based on the perception that you as a physician are altruistic, that you always put patients first, that you practice scientific integrity, and the decisions that you make are evidence-based. Now, this is something you will have to work on your entire life, work on as an individual practitioner, and work on as a professional society, the Pediatric Society or the National Society. And there are constant factors that are eroding public trust. And in my opinion, one of the biggest factors is the relationships with physicians and particularly surgeons with industry. When I became president of the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons in February of 2005, 1 month later, the Department of Justice was seeking subpoenas to orthopedic implant manufacturers and looking at what their ties to surgeons. They were giving them money to use their products, but not really getting anything in return. And in America, in 2010, this led to what's called the Sunshine Act, where all funds, this was signed into law by President Obama in 2010, and what it is that every single dollar over $100 is recorded on a national database site, and every physician is listed here, and you can look up every single physician in America and see what monies they receive from either implant manufacturers or drug companies. And pretty soon, in January of 2024, in California, which is always leading the charge in the United States, every physician will have to disclose this to every patient they see. It will have to be on their website. So I'm showing you my page, which is my disclosure. And you can see that basically in the year 2020, I took $284 from Zimmer Biomet because I took a course on vertebral body tethering. So I'm in the blue line on the graph down below, which is basically nothing. Average US doctors are the orange line, and then orthopedic surgeons are the green line above. And this is available to every single family. So I bring this up because orthopedic surgeons are particularly at risks. Our discipline, unfortunately, lacks a strong evidence base. Orthopedic surgeons are inventors of new procedures and techniques. They invent devices, and to bring them to market, they have to work closely with industry. And no greater achievement is that of John Charnley, who developed the total hip replacement. So we develop things which bring great benefit to the public. These are some famous athletes around the world. And what's the danger is that we as orthopedic surgeons just look like these athletes. You work for Stryker, not for your healthcare system or for the practice you're in. And this is what some patients perceive as their orthopedic surgeon. And if you look at the American media, you can see numerous articles every week. Doctors who took more than $200,000 from drug companies. Find out if your doctor takes drug company money. And this goes on every day. Here's one of America's top cancer doctors who failed to disclose millions of dollars from a drug company that he was working for and did not disclose his conflict of interest. And this is the law I was telling you about in California, which just passed last week, which basically says that every physician in California will have to post in their patient's medical chart their particular conflicts with industry, device manufacturers, and drug companies, and post it on their website so that every patient can see how much money they are getting from industry. It doesn't say what they're getting it for, whether it's good or bad, but it just shows what the public scrutiny, how it's changing in America. The other thing we have to be careful that erodes public trust is what's called concurrent surgery, where you're operating in two rooms at the same time. This even warranted an investigation by our United States Senate. And this expose is asking patients to say, is your surgeon double booked? Is he billing you for your procedure when he's also working he or she is working in another room? So concurrent and overlapping surgery is something that's getting public attention and also potentially eroding trust. So this is a book written by the former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, which basically says that patients must be able to trust that their doctor is not only at their side, but on their side. The second life lesson is lifelong learning. And you might say, well, of course, that's obvious. But as your practice expands, as your family life increases in complexity, this may be one of the most difficult areas to budget time for in your schedule. But I would argue that it's critically important that you do find time for continuing education. Right now, if you're a trainee, you're laying the educational foundation for the future. When I think back about when I finished my training, there's very little I do today that resembles what I did during my training. So I finished my training in 1976 and just take scoliosis surgery. At that time, patients were in the hospital for 2 weeks in traction. We applied a body cast. We cut a window in the cast. We then did the Harrington rod at that time through the cast because we were afraid that we might paralyze an asleep patient. Then 2 weeks later, we changed the cast to put on one that they wore for 6 to 9 months going home. We didn't have spinal cord monitoring. The wake-up test was yet to be described. Fast forward to 2022, when patients are in the hospital about 3 days. We have excellent spinal cord monitoring. Our patients are back in school in 2 weeks. They don't have a cast or brace. They're back at full athletic activity within 6 months. Here's some other changes over my time as an orthopedic surgeon. When I finished my training, most fractures were treated in traction. We were just beginning to do total hip replacements. Most of our hip diseases were treated with cup arthroplasty. Meniscectomies were done open. Osteochondritic lesions were just removed. And Harrington rods were just beginning to be used for spinal deformity. Now today, you look at the modern practice, you have pedicle screws, you have arthroscopy, you have O-arms, C-arms, you have reverse shoulder replacement, you have magnetic rods in the femur, you can do biologic changes for osteochondritic defects. And right now, we're in the biologic revolution. We've been through the technological revolution, which continues, but biologic solutions will be at the forefront in the next 10 to 20 years. So orthopedics is a dynamic specialty. And we have been able to alleviate pain, improve function through these technologic changes. But once again, we're in a biologic revolution, and the danger for orthopedics and why lifelong learning is important is we don't want to give these biologic treatments away to other practitioners and just be surgical technicians. We need to be up to date on the biologic solutions to the musculoskeletal problems we face. Because if you give things away to other practitioners, you will never get them back. And the other thing that lifelong learning is important for is because your patients are better educated. In America, 8 of 10 patients get their information from the internet, and there are many, many sites to look at. Consumer Reports is a magazine in the United States where you go to consult to buy your television or your washing machine. But their biggest business now is healthcare. Where are the best hospitals? Where are the best doctors? What's the top scoring hospital, in this case, for heart surgery? Where should you get your hip replaced? Where should you get your knee replaced? Now, I'm going to say that the information is not necessarily the best, but the public doesn't know that. So this is my state, Iowa, and it's asking where is the best place to get your hip replacement? And it comes to a small town in Iowa called Marshalltown. Well, if I were, and I do live in Iowa, if I needed hip replacement, this would not be where I would get my hip replacement. I would have it here at the university where the expertise lies. But this is the kind of information that is out there in the public domain. And there are also doctor rating sites, and maybe you have those in India as well. And the validity of these is certainly in question, but the fact of the matter is the public, when they look on the internet, they see these sites, and that's how they oftentimes make decisions. So continuing your lifelong learning is important so that you can be your patient's advocate. You can counteract internet misinformation, self-promoting advertising by colleagues, and direct-to-consumer marketings by the manufacturers. So if I look up what I do most often is scoliosis and look it up on the internet, none of the sites are sites that have high evidence base. This is one site that touts a brace called a spine core, 89% success rate by the leading scoliosis brace in the world. Well, the fact is this is a chiropractic site, and they talk about dozens of chiropractors around the world, over 570 years of practice combined. To the unknowing public, this seems like a wonder, but the fact is there is zero evidence base to support it. Here's an advertisement by a very famous American basketball coach talking about his hip replacement. And at the bottom of his advertisement is where you can find a surgeon who uses the hip product that he implanted. So this is direct-to-consumer marketing by the implant manufacturers. And your ability to counteract this is only based on the fact that you're current, that you're up to date, that you continue your lifelong learning. The third guidepost is putting patients first. In other words, patient-centered care. This concept has been around for more than 40 years, and this is the definition I like best, and it's patient-centered care is the provision of effective and timely medical care achieved through cooperation between the physician and an informed and respected patient. So patient-centered care basically is care customized to the patient's needs and their particular value. They are the source of control, not you. You're their navigator. Knowledge is shared, information should flow freely, and the decision should be as much evidence-based as possible. And obviously in orthopedics, a lot of what we do is not evidence-based, but it's expert-based. But still, we need to know the levels of evidence. We need to practice in a system which is safe, transparent, and we need to collaborate with our colleagues. In other words, we can't practice in a silo. We need to be interacting with our other professional colleagues in the best interests of the patient. And when I think about patient-centered care, what I think about is the kind of care or the process of care that I would expect if I took my wife to the emergency room or to the doctor, or my son. What do I expect from the provider for them? What do I expect from the healthcare system? And if you in your daily life can practice that kind of care, giving every patient the kind of care you would expect for yourself, your family, your parents, then basically you are practicing patient-centered care. And what is known from patient-centered care is that patients have much better outcome, the care can be delivered at lower costs, and patients have higher functional status. Also, patients themselves are much more satisfied. Your liability risk, medical malpractice, is much lower. Your patients are much more loyal, and they also want to send their friends to see you. And your practice is much more efficient. And this is basically good practice management. The fourth point is to avoid overconfidence. And this is particularly germane, in my opinion, in the surgical disciplines. You spend years acquiring and enhancing your surgical skills. You have the ability, you get great satisfaction, hopefully at the end of the day when you leave the operating room, that you've improved function, you've alleviated pain, you've restored and improved quality of life. But a critical pitfall in surgical disciplines particularly is overconfidence. And this becomes more and more prevalent the more experience you have when things become routine. And when you become overconfident, not only are you at risk, but more importantly, your patients are profoundly at risk for you committing an error. This is a matter of patient safety. And while doing universal timeouts in the operating room, I'm sure you do this in India as well, this is all a patient safety effort, but I'm not so sure, at least in my operating room, that everybody can repeat the name of every person in that operating room despite the introductions, because they're changing every day. You may work with a different anesthesiologist, a different resident, different surgical tech, but paying attention to this surgical safety checklist is really important and deserves, in my opinion, a little better attention to detail than is currently given. But what I would say about practice and how do you avoid overconfidence is you should never view surgery as routine. You need to pay attention to detail, even if you've done this surgery 1,000 times. And I use airline pilots. Your pilot, every time they take off, is going through a safety checklist. And each of us in our practice, even myself, even though I did everything in pediatric orthopedics, trauma, lower limb surgery, upper limb surgery, now my practice over time has evolved primarily to children's hip and spine surgery. And I've done 5,000 scoliosis operations. But every day in the operating room, I carefully think about that patient. What is their name? What am I doing? And totally focusing on that surgical episode and not thinking about anything else. And what I see is happening in my lifetime is a lot of failure to identify patients as human beings. For example, when I make rounds in the afternoon, a nurse will say to me, "What about the tibia in room 24? Well, who is the tibia in room 24? Or they'll say, "Doctor, can we give bed 903-1 some Toradol or ketorolac?" Well, who is that? And the resident's saying, "Well, what's up next? The carpal tunnel." Patients have names, and you need to concentrate for that brief moment on who that patient is, what they're having done, what you've done to them, what surgical procedure. Humanize them. What's their job? This is, John Smith, who happens to work as a carpenter. He needs his hands to make his living, and so on. So divorcing yourself from a patient and making them a disease entity as opposed to a human being, I think, is one of the contributing factors in this depersonalization and overconfidence. Each of us as a physician is granted a sacred privilege to be entrusted with human life. And we need to make sure that we never violate that sacred privilege. This is our obligation. This goes along with the oath we took when we became a physician. The fifth one is a little more difficult, but you can never divorce yourself from the external environment. It would be wonderful if you could practice medicine free from outside influences like the local government or the federal government. But this is not the case, at least in the United States. And I am sure in India, the federal government and the state governments influence almost everything you do. In the United States, healthcare is consuming a greater percent of our gross domestic product. It's estimated that we spend 20% of our gross domestic product on healthcare. Not only are patients better educated, people who work in the legislature are much better educated. People who pay for healthcare are much better educated. And they're wanting to know, what are we paying for? Are we getting quality for the money we're spending? So take a large company like General Motors or Ford. When you buy a car from General Motors or Ford, more of the dollars you pay for those cars goes to pay for employee health care than it does for the steel that makes up that car. And so everyone who pays for healthcare in the United States, as you know, at least 50% is private. They want to know, what are we getting? Are we getting value for our healthcare? Are we getting good outcomes for the dollars we are paying? And value in the United States and probably around the world is usually considered the outcome achieved for the dollar spent. And everyone who pays for healthcare in the US, the federal government, the state government, and the private payers are starting to look very carefully at quality by some metric over cost. Some of you listening to this webinar are leaders of the Pediatric Society and maybe the National Society. Some of you may aspire to become leaders. Some of you may actually be politicians or aspiring to serve in the Indian legislature. Well, whether you are a leader of the Pediatric Society, the Spine Society, Hand Society, the National Society, or just want to practice medicine, you need to keep yourself informed about the issues, and you need to participate in some way. Your professional society, I hope, is developing things like guidelines, appropriate use criteria, registries for different conditions, and developing performance measures. These are some of the ways professional societies can look or develop metrics, which then you can present to the people who pay for healthcare, saying, we are doing something. We are looking at outcomes. We are trying to do best practices, highest levels of evidence. Because if you don't do it as professional societies, someone, mainly the people who pay for it, like the federal government or the state governments in India, will determine what they think are the metrics you should achieve. And I would say that's not good. You want to, as healthcare providers, determine the metrics by which you are judged. It's not in physician culture to be politically active. And, you know, some of you just may have no interest at all. But I think it's in the best interest of you, yourself, the profession, and your patients for you to pay attention. Because if you don't pay attention, government bureaucrats will be making the decisions for you. So since I don't know the structure in India as well as the US, I just would say that all of you need to be an active part in the healthcare debate and have as many seats at the decision table as possible. An expression I often use is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So please, please either be involved yourself or support the members of the Pediatric Association, the National Association, who can be at the table with the people who make decisions on healthcare in India. You need to have a voice. And if you don't have a voice, I think we as a profession will suffer and our patients will not be served well. The last point I'll bring up for me as a guidepost is balance. As your career progresses, the most difficult challenge you'll face is balancing your professional career with your personal life. This balance will be affected by pressures from your patients, your colleagues, the government, and factors that are yet unknown to you. And as practitioner of a surgical discipline, much of what you do is not as predictable as some of your colleagues who might be in pediatrics or internal medicine or radiology, where their practice might fit more nicely into little time blocks. As a surgeon, your practice does not necessarily work that way. If you take trauma call, that's unpredictable. Sometimes surgeries go much longer than planned. You will miss family meals and important family events. You'll want to be at your, youngster's soccer game or tennis or badminton tourney, but something comes up that prevents you from doing this. And also, in the modern world, your spouse or partner may also have a demanding career. And you also may become a parent or have multiple children, which also adds to your responsibility. And I think it's very important in life to have sensitivity to the needs of your loved ones, your spouse, your children, because maintaining this constant homeostasis between your work life and your personal and professional life will be one of the most important and, I would say, the most challenging tasks that you will confront throughout your career. Your spouse and your children all deserve happiness the same as you do, and how you remain sensitive to their needs and balance the demands of your very demanding career and the career of your spouse, or even if they're a homemaker, that's also quite a demanding job. You need to work on this work-life balance. So in summary, for me, as I look back on my very happy life in orthopedics, these are things that I found to my guide as my guideposts. Working as an individual, as a collective group, and as a profession to maintain public trust. Lifelong learning so that I'm always at the top of my game, so that I can always provide my patients with good advice as I help them navigate these difficult decisions they have to make, to give them the best evidence to think about, and also so I can protect them from the misinformation that's often out there on the internet. Practicing patient-centered care, always giving patients the same kind of care you would expect for your spouse, your children, your parents, your loved ones. If you can do that each and every day, no matter how busy you are, you will find your practice much more fulfilling. Avoiding overconfidence. As you get more senior and your practice narrows down and you do the same thing over and over again, it's easy to become overconfident. But humanizing your patient to know who they are, what they do, why you're doing the surgery you're doing and how it will affect their life, their expectations, and always paying attention to detail, never getting distracted in the operating room by phone calls, by unnecessary interruptions, etc., will ensure that you have a good, happy outcome in the interactions you have. Being an active participant in the healthcare dialogue, the hardest one for many people to do because they have no interest in it. But even if you as an individual have no interest, you need to support your colleagues who do have an interest so that you do have a seat at the table. And the last, most difficult one is maintaining balance in your personal and professional life. You have to have a happy home life, and having that means respect for your partner in life, and making sure that they have as happy a life as you do. And this is a very, very difficult balance for busy surgeons to achieve, but one which I assure you takes constant attention and energy. So as I end, I hope that all of you reach all of your goals, you climb the mountains you wish to climb, and I hope these guideposts have been of some help to you as you go forward with your professional careers. Thank you very much for having me today.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart, for like wonderful explanation about your perspective about the life. Would you like to take few questions? These are
Yes,
not questions, but basically like we would like to understand with the more details. So the first question, but before that, let me welcome Freeman Miller. Freeman Miller, can you start your video? The Freeman Miller is going to be the next speaker on in this series, and he said that I would really love to listen what Professor Weinstein wants to say. So that's why we invited him also on the stage.
very good,
So,
wonderful.
yeah. So the first question, what you said is like learning or like life is a learning process and learning is lifetime process. The most important question is like after say like 30 years of practice, most of the surgeries become very routine for you because you have done it number of times. So at that particular time, how do you remain in a learning mindset?
Sure, good question. Well, for me, even though let's say I've done 5,000 spinal deformity operations, every single case is different. The tissues are different. The anatomy is slightly different. The flexibility of the curve is different. For me, I look at it as a new, exciting experience every single day or twice a day. And I don't view it as routine. I view it as, wow, this is fresh, this is new, and what can I learn from it? And also at the end of the case, I always, for surgery, I debrief. Yesterday, for example, I did a Pemberton osteotomy and a scoliosis. And I always think to myself, what could I have done better? What could I have done more efficiently? Was there any problem during the case? Was I happy with everything? Where could I have been better? Even though I've done it thousands and thousands of times. And I must admit, I always find I can do something better or different, or, you know, maybe I should have used this corrective maneuver. Maybe I should have done something different. Not to be specific, but I don't view it as routine. Plus, I make it a point every patient, before I operate on them, I review who is this patient? What is their name? Where are they from? You know, they're all children, but, you know, like was this girl is a college student. She likes to play volleyball. She wants to be, you know, a teacher. Just anything in my mind that humanizes that patient as opposed to a scoliosis. And I find that quite helpful because it ups my intensity, my sense of responsibility. So those are kind of things, they're my own tricks to make things exciting and different every day.
Yeah, you are right that like we should not look at the person as a like the scoliosis patient or a carpal tunnel syndrome patient, but it's more of a human being is, and we need to look at those social part of the person. That's really very important thing. But the another question which I have is like at this stage, like we are having an information overload, so many journals, so many webinars. So we really need to be choosy, like how to have that time. Yes, we all have a limited time, and how to spend that limited time for that value addition. So how do you decide that?
Yeah, and I would say that is very difficult challenge because even in our area, pediatric orthopedics, you have, you know, 5 to 7 journals if you're interested in spine also. And it's there, I would say there are a lot of articles, and I would say I skim everything. I read the abstract of everything, but to find high level evidence, I think there's not that much. There are a lot of opinions. There are a lot of low level evidence papers, level 4 or 5, So, there's nothing wrong with that, because if I see a level 4 evidence paper from someone who I respect and admire and personally know them to be a very good thinker, well, I pay attention to that as well. That's very hard for a young surgeon who's just starting out and may not know people personally. But I do think I skim everything. I try to concentrate mostly on the higher level evidence papers, but even those are not necessarily definitive. And then you're also the difficulty with new technology as well. You want to be cutting edge, but when is it ready for everyone to use? Let's say vertebral body tethering, that's a hot one in spine. Well, I think that it starts out that this is the indication, and it keeps going like this and this and this, and everything you have to take with a grain of salt. And will tell you one other lesson, which I didn't add there, is I'm always consider myself one fad behind. I don't really care to be on the cutting edge. I'd rather be doing something that I know has a reasonable evidence base. And if a patient wants to go to somebody else who's the cutting edge, well, fine. I am unwilling to experiment on my patients.
Yeah, Manoj.
Wonderful, Professor Weinstein, to hear your, decades of experience and wisdom coming through in this 40 minutes talk. If I may ask you something about what, all these years, what would be your strategy to deal with complications that you encounter? Do you kind of take them personally as an individual that something has happened? Do you accept them as inevitable when you do a certain number of cases and say that's par for the course? If you do 100, you're likely to have a certain number. How do you kind of not let it weigh you down? How do you kind of, what is your strategy? Do you kind of, go back to the basics? Do you kind of consult others? What is your strategy over all these years?
Yeah, that's a very, very difficult question. It's also a subject of another talk, is dealing with bad news. How do you handle that? So I would just say that I think it's extremely difficult. And I think if you are a consummate professional, you take it personally. Yes, complications happen. Every procedure we do, doesn't matter whether it's a Salter, Pemberton, nailing of a tibia or something, they all have potential complications. And some are worse than others. And I take all of them personally, because I feel in some way it's a failure by me. And I think to deal with them, number one, it helps to have a good relationship with the family. So interpersonal relationships before you operate. Now, this isn't possible in trauma. There's no relationship building. But for most of us in a pediatric practice, we have relationship building with a parent and a family, and establishment of trust. And I think if you have a good relationship with the family and you're never hurry, you really talk about things and realize that there's imperfections. If you have a complication, it's a little bit easier because you have a relationship and they know that you were doing your best or trying your best. And that makes it, I guess, a little bit easier for you to take. But I always take it personally, and I look to myself to say, was this something that I could have avoided? Sometimes you get an infection. Well, maybe you couldn't avoid that. But, if you have a neurologic deficit and a scoliosis, you hit the spinal cord. Well, you caused that. There is no two ways about it. And you have to deal with that. And, some of your colleagues as well as mine, it's too much to deal with. And they either stop that kind of practice and go to, let's say, office practice. I mean, you listeners may have a complication someday that's so devastating, not only to the patient, but to you, that you can't go on. But I do think the number one way to cope with all of these things is having a wonderful, sharing, patient-centered relationship with your patients before you ever operate on them. And I think patients are much more willing to accept a problem from a doctor who they had a good relationship and who knows that they care and that it's not just these things happen. Too bad. So sorry, long-winded answer, but it's so difficult.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. Professor Weinstein, like when Manoj was introducing you, he said that you were you were president of American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons, the POSNA, American Orthopedic Association, so many associations. So like, how do you find out time for so many organizational activity? Over and above, you are chair of your own orthopedic department. So the question is like, we have 24 hours. All of us have 24 hours. And we have a professional career. So over and above, like, we have to spend time for such associations, such societies. So how do you get time for such activities?
So before I answer, I want the listeners to know that even though I did all of these things, I took 37 years of what we call level 1 trauma call. That's all trauma, adults and children. And I always had a full-time practice research. So I think the important thing for anyone listening is you need to know your bandwidth. How much can you accept? Because I don't think it's worth doing any job, whether it's a committee assignment or lead any kind of role, unless you're willing to give 100%. And as you say, you only have 24 hours a day. So for me, it was always about being efficient, not wasting time, not doing activities which were meaningless. And, you know, if you have a lot of time between cases, let's say you have a hospital is not efficient and you're doing 2 hours between cases, well, I would go do something else and work on a project or something. So I always use my time effectively. It's time management. It also helps to be married to a partner who understands your values and is supportive, because if you don't have that, it's impossible. And then I mentioned you earlier, you know, I've always been someone who could get by with a little less sleep. So I didn't need as much. I didn't need 8 hours. I could get by on 4 or 5 hours, and that worked out fine for me. But I don't know, some point in my life, I felt that I wanted to make a difference. And for me, making a difference is, as I mentioned, being at the table, not on the menu. I want to be at the table for everything that affects my life and the life of my patients. And so I found value in the activities. I wasn't doing these activities to have a feather in my cap or a plaque on the wall, which I have plenty of, but I was doing it because I wanted to make a difference either in the life of my profession and my patients. And when you're doing it for those reasons, it's not self-serving. It makes it really easy. But again, you have to have a supportive family and figure out how much you as an individual can fit in your life. But I would encourage anybody listening not to do things that you don't find of value, that you're trying to please somebody else. You have to please yourself.
You're already overshooting the time, but still I would like to ask a last question. Like, suppose Almighty gives you the same life again. What would you like to not do in the new life, which you have done in this life?
Well, I would say there's nothing, because as I think about it, you know, I love to like hike and climb mountains, and when I take vacation, I would tell you that every single, let's say Monday, when I come back to work, I am excited to come back to work. It's not like I say to myself, gosh, I wish I had another day of vacation. I had a good vacation. I did what I wanted to do. Now I want to go back and do what I enjoy. So if I had another life, I'm actually, if I could get anything, I'd like another 30 or 40 years. Now I like to extend this life because I actually love it. So I have nothing that I wouldn't have done over again. I'm a very lucky person.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom, experience, your contemplation about the life. And we would definitely invite you like further for like understanding, or like there are a lot of things which we really need to understand from you. So definitely we will invite you in future. Thank you once again for your time. And on behalf of Pediatric Orthopedic Society, I also thank OrthoTV our technical partner who is going to spread this message to the whole world by the form of YouTube and Facebook. So thank you, everyone, and have a great time ahead. Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you, Freeman.